name is Kristen Obrazel-Kulfan, and I'm an assistant teaching professor and coordinator of public history in the history department at Rutgers University, and one of the university partners with the Humanities Action Lab.
Thanks, Kristen, and I'm Liz Shevchenko. I'm founding director of the Humanities Action Lab, which is a coalition of universities and advocacy organizations and public spaces that work together to create participatory public memory projects. And we wanted to share with you a new strategy that we're developing for confronting the climate crisis with our partners, which is about activating local community memories. The project that we're hoping to share with you today is called Climates of Inequality. And it's a participatory public memory project that's created by students and educators. And so Climates of Inequality is a participatory public memory project that's created by students, educators, and community leaders in over 20 cities across the US and around the world. And in each of these localities that you see here, local teams are working together to activate the histories of what we call frontline communities that I'm sure you've talked about a lot in this conference. So those are people who have contributed the least to the climate crisis, but bear its heaviest burdens. And these teams are made up of a three-way partnership between a university that teaches a course through which students collaborate with a community organization to dig into their local histories of environmental racism and environmental justice, and then create together one piece telling their local story of a traveling multimedia exhibition that is then hosted by a public space in the area, like a museum or a public library, that also is a place for events and actions that are really digging into the roots of current environmental justice. It's also about sharing generations of frontline community strategies for resistance and resilience and mitigation. And through this, we're really trying to both create knowledge, but also action for a way of confronting the climate crisis that both understands and undoes past environmental harms. So the process of all of these communities working together is really what this is all about. So we wanted to share a little bit of a view from each of these communities and the work that they've done together. So we'll show a short video now.
The issues that we're facing now have such deep and complex roots, and we're not going to understand them alone. So what if we confronted our past as a social movement, where we're exchanging knowledge across geography, across generation, and we're always asking, how can we do it better together? That's the challenge that inspired the Humanities Action Lab.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad that we're convened together and we'll be able to...
Our coalition is made up of university partners, issue organizations, and exhibiting spaces. The Humanities Action Lab is based at Rutgers University, Newark. We're in 23 cities, and we convene together to study and understand what the most pressing social issue is, to learn from frontline communities what that struggle on the ground looks like.
We all have to develop this trust. We all have to develop rules for engagement, and that's why we
For this particular project, we decided to look at climate and environmental justice.
And many of you pointed to the ways that climate change and environmental degradation were mapping and exacerbating long histories of inequality.
This is a really ambitious experiment in working together to confront our pasts as a way of addressing social issues, but from the vantage point of these very different local communities.
South Louisiana is in many ways a frontline community in terms of coastal destruction. But the other issue that probably gets less attention is this deeper story about the struggle of African American communities in the face of industry and government.
What we're really striving for is a better way of working and relating with each other. The faculty and the students work with the community partners to develop their local story.
We chose to look at St. James, Louisiana, and what is known as Cancer Alley. And the other site that we chose is a place called Gordon Plaza, which is in the Upper Ninth Ward.
That's why we call it the forgotten community.
In the case of Gordon Plaza, that community was built on top of a toxic landfill. The students immediately started working on a historical timeline that they hoped community activists could actually use to educate the public.
And what about, have they done anything since then? Nothing?
The community members have been very welcoming to outside support, but it has been important that we all understand and be sensitive to what people are going through every day. We've been working with Mr. Leon Waters. He's giving us a historical understanding of the St. James area and how they're still very resilient. That's been able to give me more of a well-rounded perception of what's going on.
Where we were standing just now, that's a levee guide. They had to build that to hold the water in. And under that levee guide are the remains of many indigenous peoples.
This partnership affords Hidden History the opportunity to collaborate with our future. The students here represent the best hope in the forward progression of society, because hopefully much that is incorrect or wrong in our educational system will get corrected.
While we have so much data about climate change and environmental degradation, that data is not mobilizing people towards action. But what we do know that mobilizes people is stories.
After Hurricane Maria, students in my classes were homeless. Their families had to leave the island. They're starving. And I thought about how empowering it would be for my students if I trained them to collect stories from people in Puerto Rico who have survived the hurricane and the aftermath. We have teams that are going out into 9 communities across Puerto Rico, gathering stories firsthand, and they are the ones who are sharing them.
Yeah, come here. On the boxes right down there, there's a name on one of the boxes called Meals from the Heartland. Yeah.
Our team focuses on what was there before Hurricane Maria and what's not there. Did you get a picture of the water? Of the water bottle? Yeah, that's the thing. We try to individualize the catastrophes by each person, by each family. And I think photography showcases that better than any other way of writing.
Porque entonces, como éramos el único negocio abierto, la gente hacía fila por todos lados.
People always talk about climate change in terms of the future, but of all the issues that we're experiencing now, climate change is a historical one, and understanding how we got here is critical.
The Ironbound used to be Meadowlands, nature's buffer against like sea level rise and storms. But instead, Newark is 90% concrete.
If it's a 10-minute rain or a summer rain, our sewer system can't handle it and it actually backs up into the street.
Look at that on the sides.
What? Are you kidding me?
What? I really, look at that. No. Ooh. Okay, is that exciting for those of you who are sleeping? Look at you, now you smiled, yeah? Finally.
There's water coming in the bus right now, everybody.
Yeah, there is. People think you need a hurricane to do this. We don't. We just need a day full of rain. This is a problem, and not everyone lives this way, okay?
Environmental justice is all about looking at how African American, Latinx, Indigenous, and low-income earning communities face a disproportionate burden. It's also about learning from these communities the ways that they have adapted and resisted.
Es fácil identificar algo como injusto, pero es imposible definir la justicia como tal o el concepto de justicia, ¿verdad?
Vamos a tratar de obtener una definición propia de justicia ambiental con la que vamos a trabajar, ¿ok?
In Mexico City, we had an earthquake in September 2017. We are looking at the reconstruction process and how environmental justice has played a different role in different areas of the city.
Cuando estamos hablando de justicia ambiental, ¿de quiénes estamos hablando? ¿Quiénes están involucrados cuando pensamos en justicia ambiental?
People with low income have been forced to live in those areas at greater risk to earthquakes. So when the earthquake came, they were shattered and the help wasn't getting there. In order for us to integrate all of these dimensions of the problem, we have shifted from being less of a class and more of a workshop.
¿Para qué sirve la justicia ambiental? No solo para ir reponiendo, sino para prevenir precisamente estas catástrofes y que esto va generando una inclusión social.
It has been really important to give them some public policy analysis, so they have more tools to identify specific topics.
Oiga, don Toño, queremos preguntarle algunas cosas sobre el temblor.
Lo que influyó fue el sismo, pero de ahí nosotros creemos que otro factor muy importante es la extracción irracional del agua que existe en San Gregorio.
Thank you. So I think that just gives you a really good sense of what's actually happening on the ground in each of the communities that are working together on this. And I also wanted to give you a sense that each of these teams out of the process that you saw created their own multimedia portrait, their own history of environmental justice and its impact on the climate crisis in their area. But then along the way, they also were always engaging with each other virtually through an online platform that people were sort of sharing reflections of the issues that they were stumbling with along the way. And in person, coming together finally at the launch of the project, where we compiled each of these histories into a internationally traveling. They came together and actually exhibition that featured each of their local stories that launched in Newark and is now traveling to all of the cities that created it with events and actions at each stop. The exhibition includes both these panels that you're seeing, but also oral histories and interactive maps and slideshows, and it's constantly being added to and developing. It also included virtual reality 360 videos that various communities created, where they chose a place that they wanted people to kind of visit that really exemplified these issues in their areas and offered them the opportunity, both on the web and in the exhibition, to really see these places firsthand. So these are the different ways that these communities have all collaborated to really make meaning out of their local histories and the ways that they relate to each other. So now I will turn it over to Kristen to talk about how this really manifested itself in the locality that she led in New Brunswick, New Jersey.
Thank you so much, Liz. So I worked with community partners called New Labor in New Brunswick, New Jersey, which is in the center of the state. And our community partners are an immigrant advocacy organization, workers' rights organization that advocates for labor policy that supports the rights of all workers, but especially immigrant workers and especially Latinx workers. And our interpretation of the ideas that came from the leadership at the Humanities Action Lab was to approach, as members of the university community, our community partner, New Labor, and ask them, what does environmental justice mean to you? What does climate change and climate justice mean to you? And what they told us was a series of stories about how our historical geography of our city being in the center of central Jersey, in the central of New Jersey, where you have historically canals and railroads and now highways. Bringing people through this space has led to people coming to this space looking for work and drawing immigrant groups in particular. And so we conducted some research with New Labor to ask them a series of questions about what their work means and how it connects to ideas of environmental justice and climate change. And what they said, and this is their mission statement for the project that I have up on the screen here, essentially what they said is that climate justice is worker justice. There's often a sense that global climate change is something we talk about in scientific terms. And as Aaliyah and Liz mentioned, the HAL approach to exploring environmental justice issues as it relates to climate change was to move beyond the data and say, how does the human experience shape our understanding? How can storytelling and collaborative curation and research and knowledge building with communities and universities and organizations of all sorts help us build new ways of telling stories about the impacts of climate change? And so they looked specifically at workplaces and how climate change has affected the conditions in which workers are working. And so the approach of the project was to start with the contemporary problem in the present, and then look at the historical roots of that problem, looking back at the past, and then imagine what the future might look like if some of the solutions that the organizations are working on were able to be implemented and some improvements made. So in New Brunswick, the many residents work in conditions that are exacerbated by extreme weather that is induced by climate change, often in permanently temporary positions for really low pay. Recent immigrants, many of whom in New Brunswick are undocumented, most of whom are from Mexico, mostly from Oaxaca, flock to places like New Brunswick, which are referred to as Temp Towns, which are places where temp agencies basically occupy every other storefront on the streets in the neighborhoods where the majority of the Latinx residents live, and hire with, as New Labor members say, a nod and a wink, trying to find creative ways to steal wages from these workers, and are able to get away with inadequate training and unsafe practices that force laborers to work in really dangerous conditions, especially without heat in the winter and without air conditioning in the summer. OSHA does not require employers to mandate or to actually implement safe temperatures inside of workplaces. They only require them to create a generically safe working environment. And so this is something that is faced across warehouses, which we are a major shipping hub, which is a huge problem across several different industries, but especially for the employees who work there. The roots of this story go back to the 18th century, where our city, New Brunswick, became the hub city for tri-state area transportation and low-wage jobs, attracting large immigrant groups who were often unable to secure better-paying jobs due to xenophobia and a host of other reasons. In the 19th century, it was Irish American canal builders. In the 20th century, it was Hungarian factory workers. And now in the 21st century, predominantly Latinx service workers. And employers have capitalized on language barriers and the ready availability of labor to exploit these workers for centuries at this point. And so the way our community partners have tried to band together as part of this translocal coalition that the Humanities Action Lab has put together, as well as other advocacy networks, to try to support, educate, and organize workers, operating initiatives like the Latino Occupational Safety and Health Initiative, and advocating for climate change protections in labor law specifically, not just a general kind of, Green New Deal policy, which would obviously affect a lot of these conditions as well, but specifically looking to protect workers right now, even in the absence of that larger structure. And so we conducted with our community partners a series of focus groups and oral history interviews, asking workers to share what it was like in the spaces where they were working when there's extreme heat waves, or hurricanes and other extreme weather that is happening so much more frequently now as a result of climate change. And I have a clip from one of these oral histories here that I will go ahead and try to play.
En invierno es muy frío. Ahora es porque aún es frío, trabajan ahí. Y en el verano es muy caliente.
Entonces, la calefacción y el aire acondicionado no funcionaba.
No.
¿O no había?
No había. Ponen ventiladores, pero no es demasiado caliente, no se aguanta. A veces el mismo ventilador da más calor.
Claro.
Sí, entonces, y así trabajan, así siguen trabajando, no han arreglado esa situación.
So she's saying that the room temperature was always an issue. Like in the winter it's too cold because there's no heat, and in the summer it's too hot because there's no AC. They usually put fans, but the fans sometimes just make it worse because it makes circulate the hot air. So
the stories who we heard from the workers who we spoke with New Labor told us about their working conditions that in ways that sounded not at all unlike the data and evidence that we have about the conditions in which the Irish hand dug the canal that you see in front of you, and people who constructed the railroads and these bridges that you see in this historical image of New Brunswick from the middle of the 1850s. And as New Labor shared their stories with us, we shared some of these stories with them, and we were able to build this kind of sense of historical solidarity by exploring this local context, this local story that helped us to deepen our understanding of how the history of labor and migration and our environment has shaped people's lives in this specific place. And so I'll just share a couple of images really briefly of what this place has looked like, to explore the specifics of the region and how our residents have developed their own sensibilities about what it means to be from living in New Jersey as somebody who began their journey, perhaps in some cases with some of our members of New Labor, leaving Mexico and other places in Central America, also as a response to the effects of climate change on farming practices and the availability of work in some of those areas, in addition to other factors, of course. So, one of the ways that we are seeing a tremendous amount of success in the work that New Labor and other organizations that HAL has partnered with working on environmental justice is with hyperlocal policy initiatives and state-based policy initiatives, which are our Translocal network has allowed community members from New Jersey to learn from community members in Wisconsin and California and Puerto Rico and vice versa, right? That we are all able to kind of have a better understanding of what people are trying at that hyperlocal level to affect change related to environmental justice. And so through a series of campaigns associated with this motto of climate justice is worker justice, New Labor has been working toward a temp workers bill of rights and a domestic workers bill of rights, which are being proposed at both city and state levels as ways to intervene and mitigate some of the impacts of climate change and of environmental injustice. And through this traveling exhibition and the website, people have been invited to imagine what those changes might look like in their own communities as they interact with this material. So I'll now push it back over to Liz, who can share a little bit more about that. Thank you.
So as Kristen was talking about the deep partnership in her locality and what was emerging from that, there were similar partnerships in all of these communities that were working together. And one of the things that we learned and that we tried to follow through these partnerships was one of the basic core principles of environmental justice, and thinking about how to translate those into basically university partnership humanities projects, which these principles were never designed to oversee, but were really critical in everything. And I think you heard this in what Kristen was saying about, and key, we're sort of working together in solidarity and mutuality, letting people speak to themselves and being really conscious about just relationships and non-extractive partnerships. And this was, all went into the process and the exhibition, which opened in October 2018 and traveled to 2 or 3 of the cities that had created it before the pandemic sort of shut it all down. And the Translocal sort of solidarity network was really able to be activated and sort of drawn upon during that moment when all of the histories that you just heard really sort of presaged and foreshadowed how the pandemic was going to play out and how the response to the pandemic was going to play out in each of these communities. Meaning that obviously the environmental inequalities translated into these dramatic health disparities and impact of the pandemic, but also the existing histories of organizing and mutual aid really informed and were brought to bear to build community resilience in the face of the pandemic. So the partnerships and both locally and translocally kind of provided an existing infrastructure to begin to share stories of local experiences that built a portrait of national inequality that was exacerbated by the pandemic. But one of the things that we've been really questioning and interrogating, and I think is a critical question in any kind of climate work, is what is the real power and efficacy of translocal partnerships? Is it about peer learning and exchanging methodologies or strategies? Is it about a basic sense building of solidarity that we are all, can draw strength from each other's efforts? Is it about leveraging sort of political legitimacy for our local efforts? And it's certainly different combinations of those in different localities, but we're constantly trying to really understand what we should be leaning into and what we should be supporting in each of these places. And now I will turn it back to Kristen.
Thank you so much, Liz. I'm going to just share my screen again for one quick moment to highlight one of the really amazing elements of the fact that this is a physical traveling exhibit as well as something that's being built onto digitally, that people are invited to weigh in on these environmental justice issues across the different communities that contributed to the exhibit. And so there's a real diversity of perspectives as well as specific geographical related challenges that different communities are facing. And so there are policy issues that people are being asked to explore, consider their own perspectives on, which might then influence the decision-making in which they engage, their voting habits, those things, as well as thinking about their own priorities for being able to implement something like the Green New Deal, and inviting community members to have these conversations alongside activists and scholars. And that invites people to really experience the space that they're inhabiting. One panel that you see here is called Sense Your Place, and we actually have a digital version of this on the website as well, on the exhibit climatesofinequality.org, and you can click on the Take Action tab and contribute your own discussion about what you have noticed, what you have smelled or heard or seen in your community that points to legacies of environmental injustice. And I will allow Liz to come back to that in a moment, but I wanted to just share one final thing, which is that the end result in, New Brunswick is hosting the exhibit right now. And the result of the events that we've been engaging in to promote these conversations has brought domestic workers, temp workers, construction workers, warehouse workers, truck drivers, all into space together to consider how their own lives and workplaces have been affected by climate change, and to really combat the idea that is something that we hear a lot, that certain communities just aren't politically active or just aren't interested in environmental issues. I think this project is really strong evidence of how much broad-based investment there is in collaborative participatory action around these issues. So I will mute myself again. Liz, if you wanted to mention the possibilities for contributing.
Yeah, so I wanted to make sure everybody listening knew that this is an evolving, iterative project where new communities are adding their stories all the time. And we have a lot of support and scaffolding for anybody who's interested in doing that. So there's various ways that people can get involved if you would like to connect your community to this project. One is just to host some companion work around it. Together with that, you can of course host programming and events that are connecting with other partners and leaders that we have in our network. You can actually, using a whole variety of tools and resources that we have, you can create, a whole new chapter, meaning a whole new section that's on your locality that will then be in your locality, but then also travel with the exhibit to other places and teach others about your own history and experience. And we have for the next year and a half or so, a program specially for minority serving institutions that have offer fellowships for both faculty and community organizations and students to work together to develop a chapter and a sort of way of working around their community, specifically for these kinds of institutions. So I hope that, I think our contact information is on the next slide. You can reach out to either of us or check out our websites and learn how you can get involved.
Thank you so much.